So hello everybody, this is Bull again from fedibull.com, and in this video tutorial I am going to show you the entire setup of this scene file that is all happening here with real-time ray tracing using the RTX technology from NVIDIA. I'm going to show you how to set up this scene file, how to create the cameras, how to do the materials, the lighting in real time, and yeah, how you can do this by yourself as well. I'm going to show you the camera settings and the entire setup of this wonderful car here, and how you can do the real-time ray tracing in the automotive industry. And unfortunately I cannot use any high-end CGI CAD models from the industry and companies I have been working in the past. I will work in the future, and I'm working currently. But I got this very nice classic car model here, a Pontiac, provided for free from the artist I mentioned also in the description. And thank you very much for providing this wonderful model. It is for sure not a CAD data, it was modeled manually by hand. But I think he did a very nice job, and I think in terms of the presentation and for the tutorial it should serve the purpose for sure. So let's get started with everything I'm going to show you. As an overview, I show you how to set up the beautiful HDRI backdrop here. Anyways, let's get started. As you can see in my scene file, I have not a lot going on. When I click here on my wireframe, then you can see it's the HDRI dome, and we have the car model, and we have the roads. Okay, so this is very simple in the setup. And what I usually do, heads up, a little trick here is when I've used the HDRI backdrop. You can also see I have one directional light in here, but when I just use the HDRI backdrop, you can see you get really nice reflections already from the car shader, etc. But you can see that the shadow underneath the car is very light, even if in the ray tracing the GI is bouncing. But you can see that for ray tracers in general, also offline ray tracers, that's usually a little problem, because the HDRI is not an actual physical light source, and it doesn't have this power like a physical 3D light actually provides. So what I do is this: look at the shadow the HDRI is here producing. I basically set up the shot so that the directional light, which should be the sun, then of course is matching that shadow line, the angle, and you know, kind of like the shadow line here, so that the angle and the position is the same like as we know from the HDRI. And when you rotate here the HDRI, and by the way, the HDRI is a free downloadable 8K map. I also provide the link in my description, but you also can download it from my webpage as a full package. Of course, it's included in this project. But when you look around, you can clearly see here where the sun is, right? And the sun in that particular case is somewhere, when you look here in front of the car, or from the front view, it is somewhere in the back and on the right side. I would say 1 p.m., something like this. And it's very high up, so that the shadow is actually very, it's not very long, it's very short, right? And I also wanted to show you, of course, when you go into the HDRI backdrop, you can change this entire look dramatically by just rotating. So look at this. I have a rotation right now at 150. If I change this to 0, did you see this crazy jump? And then also what you notice is, for instance, if the rotation is changing here to 0, then the shadow comes to the front. That means actually the sun is now more looking against the lens, right? So when you look at this, the sun is up there, and that's the toughest thing to shoot actually, because when you have the physical camera positioned, then you're shooting against this super bright light. But you can also see that the sun from the HDRI, the shadow, is not very sharp. Imagine if this is a sunny, bright day, usually it's very sharp, right? And you get super strong shadows and a very sharp line of the shade. But here, let's go. I basically was playing around with the settings, and I wanted to make sure that my sun is somewhere in the back and is not necessarily in front of me, so that it's a little easier for the exposure, right? For choosing then the camera settings. And I was just messing around 130, 140, 150 or something like this. And this is also whatever you prefer, whatever you like. If you prefer a 90-degree angle, then you see this would be the lit side and this would be the shade side here. But what I had on here was like a 150, so it's a little more bluish. It's a little cooler also from the angle, but yeah, it's more like on the top. But here comes now the trick I wanted to show you. First thing is, look at this directional light. When you position it, and I select now the directional light and blow this up to like 10 or whatever, you can also see if I do this to 0 or 10, when you look just here on the line, right? That gives you now, if I boost this up to 20 or like 200, that you can clearly see. Do you see this line here? That line is matching now up with the HDRI line. And how I do this is basically going in, crank up the volume, and then I change the rotation. You can see that here in real time, right? Until it's really matching also the HDRI. And that is very, very important, because the sunlight has to be from the same source. And when you try to match the shot here with the HDRI, it has to align with the actual HDRI too. That helps you that you don't get two different shadow lines, but that you also get a much sharper shadow line or shade. Okay, so this is trick number one in terms of lighting and matching some stuff. What I do, and lots of people ask me how I do that, but that's how you can simulate an HDRI environment shot. Very simple, because in reality you only have one light outside, and that's the sunlight, and that's so strong that any other light you would barely see, right? So this is number one. Number two, I was asked, you see how easy the lighting setup here is, and also if you turn off the HDRI, then you can see this is just coming from the directional light. Very powerful, right? So, but when and of course the reflections are coming from the HDRI. But anyways, when I go in terms of the shaders, people also say like, oh, how can we do this? And is this really complicated? So watch this. I am using also the free Automotive material pack or shader pack. And that comes with a metallic car paint. Of course, you can change this to your own color at any time. Very simple and very easy. And you see it here, it's blue, but I can make the whole thing, for example, also red, or I can go in and can make it black. So here we go. Now this beautiful car is in red available. And yeah, it's super cool, real time. As you know, I'm a big fan of Unreal and the real-time ray tracing with RTX, because that's kind of like the real yeah, the real dream came true, that you have no more render time. But as you can see, it's really up to you how you want to shade this and how you want to use it. But you can see here the car paint is here basically blue. And of course the shader itself, if you go into the shader network, it's more complex, because you have fall-offs, you have also clear coats on top of it, and the whole thing, how this is set up, can be very, very challenging. You could also integrate flakes. That's included for all of you guys who know a little bit car paint creation or metallic car shaders from V-Ray, Corona, any other offline ray tracers. That's similar. But a trick I also want to show you, what I usually do, and what you can do is, first of all, you can use those free shader packages, right? And that makes the life very, very easy, because you can exchange color here, can change that, can change fall-offs. But I don't want to go too deep into this. But you can, it's very simple, by changing colors, etc. and make all the proper adjustments. But for example, there's also a black kind of more matte shader. I really like that one too, because I felt like this car would be super cool if it's, for example, like black matte, and then we have just the golden stuff in here. I really like that, so that's super cool. But you can choose whatever you want to have, right? You could even mix it. You can say like, I want to have the whole thing here red, whatever you prefer, right? And then just make maybe the hood black, whatever. That's the cool thing about also designing and pimping this car, because you have so many options. One more thing also I wanted to show here before I go then into the camera settings, is this, that you can even open the hood here. So he made a really nice job. And then look at this, when you have close-ups and you get in, we have even here, if I go into my camera and change here the focal point, look, we have like really cool stuff even inside of the engine. Look at the nice bokeh effect, but I'm coming to that in a minute, how I'm going to set up the camera. But it's super cool. And for example, you hopefully saw in previous videos that I'm using substance material packs or shader packs as well. I hope you also saw my previous tutorial and review about it, about the user experience, which wasn't the best, but still I love substance, even if I'm maybe hard in my reviews. But look at this, for example, if you want to change just the inside, because we want to pimp it, right? And you want to have a golden metal frame inside, I mean, that is hilarious. It's not just hilarious, it's beautiful. And look at that, details, right? Look at the bolts here. It's crazy. This is pretty big. So for all you guys know, I am shooting here this in a 3480 resolution, I think that's what it is. I have a super wide screen. This is actually recording in a 4K, but for the YouTube videos and all the other video tutorials, I have to crop it or bring it down to the 2K format. Anyways, but as you can see, even the engine, when you go make some close-up shots here, it's crazy. It's really super cool. And now I wanted to show you basically how I do the entire camera setup, the manual exposure, the bokeh effects, the depth of field, the camera work in general, because I promised you in my previous tutorials that I'm going to show you that. And then last but not least, of course, I will also show for this car the process, how I was setting it up with another software to make sure the data is prepared and everything went in through a Datasmith, because I love Datasmith. The guys over at Datasmith, honestly, they rock. They do all the coding for you. So if you have other 3D software packages you're working in, it doesn't matter if it's Max or Cinema 4D, whatever, then they already built for those two packages I'm aware of at this moment, or for now, the Datasmith package. It's a link basically that allows you to go in and click export and bring your models and the UVs and even shaders and lights and cameras and animation, everything, the whole deal here into real time. And that's what I'm using. Because it's really one of the best packages I have seen. It's really crazy. So that being said, now, oh yeah, by the way, what's really funny, or actually fun, is that he was even doing the interior. So I didn't really shade it, but it's also crazy to see that if you go in, you can change then the camera. Crank up here the exposure, that he was adding some materials as well. Exposure settings and then my camera distance. But, of course it requires more work to do it properly. But I feel like this car model is an artwork itself. So he did a tremendously fantastic job. Anyway, so going out, you see like adjusting exposure settings immediately has such a strong impact, right? So you see that here, and now let's jump into the camera setup and the camera settings and how I usually do everything from scratch. So first of all, as you notice, I usually start a cinematic sequence, and by doing that, you basically get in the lower tab here the options and the possibilities to add sign actors, or like any actor, so to speak, into the sequencer tab. And any object can be an actor. Okay, so any object you see here can be kind of like an actor, and it's called actor because it's like when you know, like shooting movies on film, on stage, right? People who are acting in movies are actors, and of course the set building and everything you have around, you can call it as an actor, right? So that's the definition in terms for Unreal. So when you look here, I created a cinematic camera, and it's basically under cinematics, and then you see the sign camera actor. So you basically drag and drop it. You have to press the G button to see it, and then you see what's going on with that particular camera, right? So you can see it here in the little window, but I can also go and look through my camera and navigate through my camera. As you can see in the new camera I created, there is the film aspect ratio different, exposure is different, but I can see it all over here. And I can also see, like, yeah, it's a moving camera, it's a moving actor object, and I have all those settings down here, every single detail, okay? So all I did was basically going in and changing that, and then I said also I want to change my film sensor to 50 and 20. That's kind of like super nice cinematic perspective of view, or like the film back settings, so to speak. And now what's interesting is that as long as this camera you have been creating is not in the sequencer, you basically cannot animate things, you cannot set keys, etc. You can change all the settings in here, but you can actually not animate it. So what you have to do is, and I'll show you this in camera number 2, you drag and drop it to your camera sequencer, you drop it here, and then you see there are a few features or parameters that are available. And as you can see, this is, for instance, here the aperture, or the so-called FStop, and that basically gives you immediately the option to change the f-stop. And the f-stop aperture, also called, is nothing else than the hole in your lens that you can change or manipulate. And as lower the number is, that's the rule, okay, as lower the number is, as larger that hole gets, and the smaller, so as bigger the number gets, as smaller it's going to be. Also, a rule is very clear: as smaller the aperture is, okay, as stronger is the depth of field, and as larger that number is and the smaller the hole is, and you can see it when it's smaller, when it's getting smaller, less light is bouncing in. This is why it's getting underexposed, right? As sharper the picture will be, or as less shallow will be the depth of field. So one thing that is very important to understand is also you can only add additional features and parameters to the sequencer and animate it if those parameters are also activated in the camera itself. Okay, so for example, if I say that I have a minimum f-stop or an aperture from, let's say, 5, and my maximum f-stop is 22, when you hit those numbers, underneath or as an extension below that number is nothing happening anymore, or above the max f-stop of 22, nothing is happening anymore, and there's no effect on the camera itself. And I'll show you this because you lock it down to those values. Okay, so watch this. We are having an f-stop from 7, but as soon as you hit 5, nothing is changing anymore. Do you see that? So you scroll down and it's 4, but it's 3, 2, I'm going down to 1, but the picture, the exposure stays the same, but it shouldn't, right? And lots of people ask me and said, like, Bernhard, it must be a bug or something is wrong with my camera settings, but I can assure you there is not a bug. What you have to do is you can set, for instance, for example, the minimum f-stop to 0 and the maximum, let's go up to, I don't know, 100. Usually in a camera, in a physical accurate lens, if you have an f-stop from 1, this is already pretty expensive lens as well, as long as it's not just a fixed one. That's the regular, lower amount of the aperture. And in the f-stop, in the maximum, you have usually 24f or 32f, depending on specific brands, but that's what you usually can find. So if you want to have full range, because it's digital and you can have all the cameras you want, you can have the most expensive lenses on your camera. That's cool about it, right? Then I say you can go to 0 and go up to 100, and now you have full range. And now you see already how it has an impact to the exposure, because you can go to 0 and you can also go all the way up to 100. And at 100 you see like the only thing you can see is literally those headlights. Okay, so this is. So keep that in mind. What is also important, the blade count. That's basically in the lens how many blades you have for the iris that is kind of closing it or opening it. Okay, I like here 5, and I'll show you why. Because when you choose 5, you get a really nice bokeh effect. So when I open this and change now my kind of like my manual focus distance, right? You see that here. Then you get those super nice shapes. Do you see that? And depending on the blade count, you get different kinds of shapes and forms. So if you change this to 20, you have so many that it gets round, right? If you change this to 3, you have basically a rectangular or like 4 edges. Sorry, you can actually, see, this is what I just figured out. Sorry about that. You cannot change it below 3 because you need to have at least 4. And there is actually even more. You can change the shape of that with also with the texture map. You can fake it, so to speak. But what I like is usually I like to use 5 because I really like that shape and that form, and that gives it also a very nice, cinematic kind of like look. So this is really super cool, and I wanted to show you for sure. Then if we go through those settings, which I just did with you, you can also see one more thing. And this is super important. It's again the so-called manual focus distance, right? So when you have a lens, of course, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you can change the focal point or the focus distance. And this is nothing else as here as the manual focus distance. But you need to make sure that your camera has it set to manual, because if it's set to none, then look what's happening. Everything is sharp and stays sharp, and it doesn't matter what you change here in your manual focus distance. You have no more control, and it's gone. That option, that feature is gone. So look at this. If I go to 1 or 4, or I blow it up to 2000, there's nothing changing anymore. Everything is always the same. So you want to make sure that basically focus settings is set to manual. And there is another cheat, or like a help, I would say a help, which you don't get from a camera in reality, and that's it's a picker, so to speak. So you take this here, the picker, and select then in the viewport what you would like to have in focus, and that can be very, very helpful if you don't know exactly, for example, like how far away it is or what's the distance, right? So if I choose here, for example, oh, sorry, I forgot one more thing I wanted to add immediately, that we can actually play around here with also, so to speak, film ISO settings, so the exposure values. So you can type in ISO, and you can see the ISO is the film sensitivity. And also that needs to be activated, because if it's not activated, right, you cannot use it. So you see, like, as higher the number is from the film ISO, as more sensitive the film is. That means if the film is more sensitive, you know, the development of the film is like, it needs less light, okay? So it goes back to the old school film development process, which I did as a kid in the darkroom with my brother. So I was lucky that he did a lot of photography, and I learned this as a kid in the darkroom. I remember I was like maybe 11 years old, and we have been developing all those film things with the chemistry. It was really fun. But so you learn what specific film you used and how it developed, right? And all those traditional photography elements have been integrated into the digital world. So the ISO, you have to understand, is film sensitivity, and as higher the number is, it's more sensitive. That means if it's more sensitive, it develops faster, and if the light comes in, then it gets brighter, right? So if you lower it, the film sensitivity, you have here basically a different exposure, because, you know, that's combined with the exposure here. Maybe one thing I wanted to mention is, in real film, that means also higher ISO usually had much more grain and noise in it. But for example, here with the retracing, you don't see that at all. That doesn't exist here anymore, which is an advantage for you, because you can always add noise on top of it later if you want to. So, but that's important. Also important, you can control and animate any of those values here in the sequencer. But how can you get those values over? And I want to show you that. So you click on the camera, and you see here on underneath is the camera component. You click on track, and when you look at that, then you can clearly see, wait a minute, there are film back presets, film back settings, right? You see the sensor width, the sensor height, and this is exactly what you have over here, right? The sensor width, the height, and so on. And you can actually, you know, basically select what you would like, what specific parameters you would like to animate, you would like to have in your sequencer. And the post-process settings is one of the most used ones. I use it literally all the time. Has so many things in it, like from the lens bloom to the lens camera. So literally every single parameter can be adjusted. So the most important thing you have to know is that literally any parameter you can bring from the camera settings, you can find under the detail settings here over to the sequence, and then set keys and animate it. But to keep the focus here on the camera, I want to go through these settings and make sure that everything is kind of understood. So the focus method is like manual, and as you can see, if you are going to change also the current aperture, right, everything is changing. So to show you also the exposure compensation, that's the easiest way to do it also over here then in the animation. I usually type in exposure, and then I go into exposure metering mode and set like manual, okay? And then you can clearly see I can crank up here also the exposure compensation. You type in the number you want until the exposure is kind of like there. And this is something similar like the ISO, okay? So now once this is set up, you can also clearly see now the impact here of the exposure. And also what I usually do is I go then into and add it to the animation post-process settings and go into where is it, on the post-process exposure, and then I change here or add the exposure compensation. Now you see exposure compensation is here at 11. It's the same value then, and then you have it also here over on the left side where you can animate it. Very simple if needed, okay? So one thing also, as I mentioned before, is of course the focal point as you can see, the same number, 16.3, 16.3, I cranked this up, is this one here. And now you can see if you have a camera, also let's change here the lens to, let's say, an 80 mil. You can clearly see then the depth of field is changing. If you go here to 1, and then we change the exposure down to like 5 or whatever. Now watch this, you can clearly see the shift in the camera lens, right? So at 270, roughly like this, kind of like the license plate gets sharp, and the grille, the front of the car, and everything else gets blurry. See a nice bokeh effect here on the chrome material. And another way to do that is activating the so-called focus plane. It's a debug draw mode, or draw debug. And when you do that, you can actually see where you set your focal point in 3D. So that's pretty cool. And it always is linked to your camera. As you can see, if I move back my camera, and this gets all purple because the color here is basically set up for purple, but I can get a visual representation of my plane. Where is my focal point, right? So right now my focal point would be straight in the middle of the car. But of course, if I move my camera forward or backward, it's moving with my focal point because I set the focus distance and it's linked to my camera rig, right? So this is linked to my location. But if you are unclear, or you're having a difficult time visualizing the focal point or the focal distance, you can actually use the debug plane. You could also change the color here. If you don't like purple, just change the color, whatever you like. But I actually am so happy with the real-time preview that I never use it, and I don't actually need it. So what else? We have been talking about the focal length. This is also already set over here. Focal length is basically the lens on your camera. So you can go with a super wide angle lens like 5 millimeter, right? Look at this, how crazy that distortion would be. I don't know, I just bought recently also the GoPro Black 700. I didn't look at their specification if you have a fisheye lens or something like this, but I think it's something around 10. Maybe I'm wrong right now. But as you can see, the distortion, if you have a super wide lens, super wide angle lens, this is kind of killing it, right? So usually the human eye is around like 45 to 55, something like this. But if you get like a 50 mil lens, it's still wide angle, kinda. And we called previously, when I was in sports photography and you're doing, you know, shooting sports players far away, you have a super long lens, like a 200 mil, like this is a 200 millimeter lens. And we called this also teleobjective or teleobjective, so to speak. Yeah, sorry, it's the German thing, German terms as well. But what you have to be careful is for sure not mixing it up with crazy values that you get a so-called miniature effect. So you see here, if I, for instance, take a 400 mil, I use a 400 millimeter lens and zoom out here and then change my focus point. I don't want that my car looks like a toy. And you can achieve this by going to crazy numbers, right? And you see here 400 millimeter, and then you have an f-stop from 1 that looks kind of like the miniature. And I usually avoid that then too, but I would say maybe you have here 4.5 and open the exposure, then it looks again more real. But what I love so much about the digital camera settings or the digital power, whatever you have here, is of course like you have all the power and all the gear you want to have. Imagine you would buy all those lenses and the camera bodies full frame or other cameras, they're not full frame and they have some crop factor. In reality, I mean, that equipment costs thousands of dollars, right? You would need to invest. And it's so cool that everything in 3D is now provided, and you can actually be a photographer in 3D space and create stunning, nice pictures, right? Plus animation, so there is everything included. So let's get to the next options here. Lens settings, we had film back settings. I think that speaks for it automatically. And then in the post process is also, there have been older settings for depth of field that changed with the latest package. So depth of field is automatically assigned and it's applied as long as you make sure you have the manual focus up and running. So now the next thing is the bloom effect, and I think that is really very, very important. And for that reason, I assigned a glow material to the headlights, right, to the front lights, to show you then also the intensity and how you can play with it, because you can clearly see you can go crazy with the bloom here, right? And you can also change, of course, the for example, the threshold, right? So that means at what specific point is the bloom breaking apart or is not breaking apart. So this is really cool to control as well. And you have actually two options. You have a standard bloom that you can control the intensity and then the threshold, right? If I go here to 500, you see like 200, 100, it goes lower and lower, 80. And it's totally up to you and shot based how you want to deal with this. Some people overdo it with the bloom effects, you know, but it's for sure like a personal flavor, what you like. Like J.J. Abrams is known for a lot of bloom, but also like streaks and flares, and lens flares. But you have here those two options. You have standard, you have convolution. And once you hit convolution, you basically don't have any more settings here or like options you can choose, because as soon as you turn this on to 0.01, the convolution kinda is set more rigid and just kicks in hardcore, as you can see, from a specific angle of the car. And I would say that's for sure a post-process feature that's totally up to you what you prefer to use. But I wanted to show you that the bloom settings can be completely also turned off. If you set everything to 0, then it's completely gone, because some artists also complain that everything is bloomy. That's why I don't like Unreal, because everything is just super bloomy. And I have to say, yeah, you can turn it off, of course, and make everything crisp and non-bloomy. Okay, so here's basically the shot now without any bloom. But if I change a little bit the intensity and crank up here my threshold, this is, for example, how it looks. But there is one more thing. When you see that, there's also the lens flares, okay? And those lens flares, you can also control them individually, and you can also turn them off. As you can see here, if I bring in the intensity, right, from this lens flare, then you can see that you have also bokeh sizes and shapes you can control. And I have to say, when I look at this, it's really cool, especially when you see those specular highlights. They can really add this extra cinematic look. But you can also overdo it, right? So it's all really a balance about mixing it up in the right combination. And some people say, oh, I don't want to have them at all. Just like remove everything, and you can say like intensity is 0, bokeh size is 0, and then it's gone. And if you still have a bloom, but you want to change this to 0 as well, then you see it's crisp and clean, and you just don't have any glare and flares and bloom on it, okay? But the cool thing is it's also in real time. It goes so quick. You can make these proper adjustments as you would in any post-process, software. So what is next? Next thing is camera options, focus settings, aperture. We went all through this, and now we're in the post-process settings. We went through the bloom. There's even more settings, advanced. You can play with those. You can really control a lot of things, but you know, in my opinion, they're not all needed. It's really cool that they provided it, but they're not all needed. So one thing I wanted to show you is chromatic aberration. And it's very simple. You can go in and you activate chromatic aberration, and you can see that the color spectrum, I always call them those rainbow colors, but it's the breakup in R, G, and B, kind of like in the spectrum. On the edges, you can see what it does. It looks like you're on LSD or something like this, and you're totally stoned, right? And for instance, when you look at a TV screen, you can clearly see in film and on TVs this chromatic aberration that was always produced because like of the breakup from the three colors. And later on, people said, oh my God, this is so cool. I want to add chromatic aberration to everything because it makes it look so much more real. But you can also overdo it and ruin shots. And I have this tendency to really say like, you know, honestly, I want to keep it subtle. And you can see it here, what's happening, a shift, a start in the offset. You know, you can control where the start of this offset would be, and you can kind of see it here, how it looks like. It's building like a wave in it. But I have to say that chromatic aberration, I for sure keep it very subtle. So, and that subtleness means I barely go beyond 0.2 or 0.3. Just so that you have it a little bit added and it's not really visible for your eye. But I also have to say it depends on the lighting and on every specific shot. So maybe here, that you can even notice it, you might probably want to have 1. You might see some of it in the breakups on the edges. It's very subtle, but I would not go super crazy like this is 10, 5, 3, 2. You see, like it's getting to a point where you overdo it. So then further below here, you find the ISO settings. And I didn't even mention that there's a difference between a regular standard still camera, where you can also control the shutter speed. That basically means how long does the shutter open to let sunlight in, right? And how fast does it go? And it also correlates, of course, with motion blur, or like if a shot gets blurry or not blurry. So if you would shoot with an ISO of 100 and you have a shutter speed from 1/60 of a second, then this gets already to a point in reality where shots might get blurry. So imagine if somebody would walk here, right, and you would shoot that with a 60 of a second, then it would get blurry because the shutter speed is closing too slow. But if you want to have sharp and non-blurry pictures, you would have 600 of a second. So the shutter opens super fast and closes super fast. It's like a shot, poof. It goes super quick. But the thing is here that once you have the aperture and you also have the focal length, and you're not so worried about, because it's a still shot, about motion blur, and then it really doesn't matter a lot. But it affects for sure the motion blur. So that means if you're shooting here with a lower shutter speed, the motion blur goes up. And if you have a faster shutter speed, you have barely any visible motion blur. But this only also applies to a still camera, because a still camera is different to a real film camera. A real film camera has actually a disc in it, a circle disc, and you have how to say that, like when you visualize it as a cake, you have actually then a disk, and you can open that disk. It's rotating all the time, and with this disk rotation, you can control the shutter speed and also the motion blur, right? So, but this is everything you need to know for that now. We went through bokeh size, that you can change, of course, how big the bokeh should look like if you have a bokeh effect on it. You can change the bokeh shape. You have also here the threshold. You can change the color of it, and you can also tint it in all kinds of different ways, as you can see here. So, image effect, that's maybe something very powerful and important you should know, is vignetting. So vignetting, as you can see here, is nothing else than if the outside of the camera lens gets super bright, you can do a vignetting effect, and the vignetting is here is a black color, and you can change the intensity. If I make this 10, look at that, right? 5, 4, 3, 2. You can open that, and you can also go very extreme. I have a tendency to use it slightly on the edges, you know, to darken a little bit on the edges, and that the focal point is more to my object in the center. Grain, film grain, and as you can see here, that's the grain jitter. You could also assign that. Usually I don't add any grain here because I know if I would render an animation, I can also add film grain later on in post with any grain adding here in the render process. So I have full, doesn't matter if you use After Effects or whatever, and you don't have any flickering going on because I added from picture to picture. But basically that film grain or grain is as a compensation to any film grain you would get from an actual film camera. And yes, it adds some more realistic effect to it because a real film camera would have this film grain. And that's why lots of people are actually also using it. And say like, no, it looks like an actual real film, like we know from the movies, right? So this is important, but I turn this off here. Okay, and turn off, yeah, the vignetting 0.4, we can leave that. And then I go into the white balance. White balance, as you can see, is super important. This is like the classic white balance on a camera too, because you can change now the white balance. Like, where is it? Is it the cooler? Is it warmer? Etc. And this is up to your shot, and you can also change and set this up. Now under the global settings, we are getting already in color correction. And as you can see, you can change saturation overall from everything. So you make this shot like super pop, right? It pops. I mean, look at the yellow here on the street. It's kind of insane. But that's basically all in real time. That's the cool stuff. And it's really up to your style. When you look into cinematography, also, you know, what people are using, subtle colors or like super poppy colors. You can go in and change the contrast. Look at that, like from flat, shooting flat to like super high contrast. You can stay in the center at 1. You also have gamma control. So what are you shooting with what freaking gamma settings? Gamma was back then with the linear workflow in offline renders always a big topic, because the linear workflow is the way you comp back things in 32-bit. If you're not familiar with it, don't worry too much about it. Lots of people got butt-headed and started fighting each other because of a linear workflow and whatever. But fact is, it's a gamma curve. That's what you should understand and know for now, and it gives you a more realistic look and feel. But because this is all in real time and everything is retraced with a straight gamma value of 1, you don't even need to worry about anything else at this point. It's all for the screen optimized. So you have also gain. So that means you can gain the exposure and boost it a little bit and so on. And you can control offsets, you know, which has also an impact to the overall look in photography, like changing contrasts, making the shot like look as you want to look it. Also, keeping in mind you have all the RGB values here you can screw around. That means in terms of color grading, in real time, you can change this so it looks more like a retro look. And you might know this from post-process comping software packages. You might know Magic Bullet in After Effects, or After Effects or Fusion or Nuke, whatever it is. Or you might know it from cell phone filters, right? So it doesn't matter if you use Apple or Samsung, but you know apps like Instagram, and they have thousands of filters already, I guess, and they have presets, and those presets is basically nothing else that they're shifting the RGB values into a specific different location, and then you get all these kind of different looks. But like I said, the color grading is a process. Also, what it's up to the artist. It's basically how you feel that look, you know, that the final shot should look like. Everything, like it's artwork, it's the lighting, it's the camera, it's the shading, it's the final color grading, whatever you like. This is your work, right? And I think there are no rules. It's all taste, right? And I never would argue about what tastes better, vanilla ice cream or chocolate. Well, I love them both. So anyways, you see you can split this up. You can change the saturation just of the shadows. So you have shadows, midtones, highlights. Very important, of course, that you have those controls. And I think, so this will just change now the saturation of the shadows, right? So if you want to have higher saturated shadows, then as you can see everywhere, when you go crazy with this, right? I mean, those values are abnormal. They're not like, no, they're crazy. But you can see this impact. It's insane, right? What impact it will have to your shot. And you can change for the shadows, saturation, contrast, gamma, gain, offset, and so on. Everything separated. So for the midtones and so for the highlights. It's kind of crazy. Maybe also what is cool is you can have two viewports, and then in those viewports you can also say I want to see camera actor number 1. You go into the lit mode, and in the second one you can also say I want to see camera actor number 2. Now you can compare them, as you can see, side by side, and you can also then specify, identify, and say like, wait a minute, what am I going to do here? Do I rather go with the settings on this side, or do I rather go with the settings on that side? Which is really fantastic that you have all these options and those possibilities and output the artwork you like to do. Maybe also you see here a camera animation in real time on the left side. It's basically setting up a few keys, moving that camera, and making sure that you have an animation going on. And how that works is showing camera 2. It's so simple. So you select that camera 2 is selected, and then you can see here that I key every single frame, right? When you click on that, key all, key every single frame is turned on, allow all the edits, okay? So that's what I do. And then in the transform node on frame 0, I click key. Now all the transform nodes, location, rotation, and scale is kind of keyed. You can also like key everything else, whatever you want to have, and set here key. I missed just, no, it's fine. And now if you move the camera to, let's say, frame 500, and you move your camera, doesn't matter in what direction, you move it up, you move it down, or whatever. So let's do it this way. Then you see the animation is actually already set. Now watch this. Camera started at frame 0, now it ends at frame 500, and camera is basically zooming out, right? You can select all those keys, can push them back. Now it goes much faster because I shortened, of course, the keys. So look at this, and the animation goes quicker. An important step I always show everyone is relatively quick as well. Sign actor camera 2 is selected and I show the curve editor, make sure you have that selected, and those are like all the transform nodes. And as you can see, as a standard, there's always an ease in and an ease out in the curves, but you can select all of them and then make them linear. Okay, so now what's happening is the camera is linear. It doesn't start slowly and then, you know, accelerates and stops slowly. It's a linear path animation, and sometimes you want to have it, sometimes you don't, but you can control also these keys manually and animate the camera as you want. Also, maybe one thing I want to show you is rotation is pretty cool. So if I start with this camera here and roll it, I could start like the super cool shot, like something like this here. You see, like when you roll it, car looks more sexy, right? And then maybe as the camera moves back up, you roll out or you change that and it's more straight. And this is like so cool because that can be used for previous but also for final production. It gives you so many options. It's literally insane. It's really crazy, and you can see everything in real time. What else? So in the post-process volume, I also wanted to mention that you are not getting confused. You also have bloom effect and glare effect. So you have, you know, a lot of additional effects you can also find, of course, in your camera settings. But as you can see, when you go into the post-process volume here and you change the intensity, then the bloom effect will be applied. But you see, like on this one, it's camera 1, it's applied, and here it's not applied. And the difference is this: when you go into sign camera actor number 2 and you also check now the bloom, then you can see we activated it, and the camera settings are stronger than the post-process volume settings. So that means we said to that camera, set it to 0, we don't want to see anything. So because of that, right, and because it's overriding the post-process volume settings, the camera settings, you will not see that, okay? Because when you check this, as you can see, then your camera settings are overriding those settings, okay? And then you can control it here with your camera. So you need to really specify and identify how you want to control it. Some people just stay within the camera and say like, I just want to have my camera set up and I don't care about the post-process volume. Other people say like, I rather work with the post-process volume and do all those tricks and things on top of it, whatever you like, but you have both options. So that's about it. Don't forget to subscribe, download the scene files for free. You get everything, you can experiment, have fun learning, and thanks for watching, and I hope I could help you. Till my next video, again, this was Bernhard from fedible.com. Have a great rest of your day and happy pixeling. Take care. Bye bye.